In this lecture, we're going to talk about circulation and respiration in animals. Now, in a multicellular organism, cellular metabolism requires regular delivery of nutrients and oxygen to the cells so that they can complete cellular metabolism. And then once that's done, metabolic waste created by this cellular metabolism have to be removed from the cells. So this includes nitrogenous waste when you're breaking down proteins, and then carbon dioxide from the metabolic activity, and a variety of other waste products can be formed. Now, if you're a single-celled protozoan or a very small aquatic invertebrate, this is pretty easy to deal with because you simply have diffusion across the cell membrane or the epithelial layer, if it's an animal, take care of this. So you absorb the oxygen you need, and it goes directly to the cells through diffusion, and you, in the reverse, get rid of CO2 through your skin. But larger multicellular organisms have to have evolved systems to deal with these issues. And this includes the circulatory system for the delivery of nutrients, oxygen, hormones throughout the body, and then removal of metabolic waste. The respiratory system is crucial in its interactions with the circulatory system. It's at the respiratory system level where you're uptaking oxygen from the environment and also releasing carbon dioxide waste into the environment. Now, these materials are then given, once the oxygen is absorbed in the respiratory system, it is then shuttled to the circulatory system for delivery throughout the body, and the same thing for carbon dioxide. The circulatory system delivers the carbon dioxide to the respiratory system that then sheds that into the environment. So that's the reason we're lecturing about the circulatory system and the respiratory system together, is they really work hand in hand in most cases. Well, the type of circulatory system you're most familiar with is a closed circulatory system. And this is where the blood fluid is confined to a series of vessels that deliver and remove materials to and from cells. Now, what causes the movement in most cases in a closed circulatory system is a heart, or in some cases multiple hearts. These are pumping organs that drive the blood through the vessels. Now, the vessels have different names. Blood leaving the heart is called an artery. Arteries break up into smaller arterioles that then break up even smaller into capillary beds. And it's at the capillary beds where the system technically is open, because the blood is then just infused with the cells where the transfer takes place. Waste products that are released by the cells in the capillary beds then dump these materials into larger venules that then converge into even larger veins that then return this material to the heart to continue the circulation. So here's an example of a closed circulatory system in an earthworm. And you can see at the anterior or the head end of the worm, we have a series of aortic arches that serve as some of the hearts, the pumping structures. And the ventral vessel, in this case, is acting as the artery, pumping blood away from the heart. Then it goes through different parts of the body, through the arterioles and the capillary beds, before then it enters the venous system in the dorsal part of the worm, where it then is pumped back to the anterior end. Now, there have been some interesting patterns in the evolution of closed circulatory systems in vertebrates that I wanted to cover. Fish have a closed circulatory system, but it's a very simple system where blood only makes a single pass through the heart during its circuit. And we're going to see that in other vertebrate groups, it's a more complex system. Now, this works fine. Blood is pumped throughout the body, and it's delivering oxygen and nutrients to the tissues and then returning waste products to the heart through the venous system. But there is a problem once the blood is pumped through the gills to get oxygenated and to get rid of its CO2. So the blue here is the unoxygenated blood, and the red is indicating oxygenated arteries. Once the blood pumps through the gills, the emerging blood is oxygenated, but it has very little blood pressure to deliver this to the rest of the body. So the problem with this system is low blood pressure after the blood passes through the gills. It works okay, but it's not the most efficient system for delivery of the nutrients to the body's cells. Now, one of the fish lineages that we're going to cover later on in this semester has evolved a double circulatory system to deal with this issue, and this has been inherited by all the terrestrial vertebrates, including the amphibian as shown here. The double circulatory system solves the problem of the blood pressure being too low going to the body. The double circulatory system, as the name implies, is a two-circuit system. There's a pulmonary circuit, which takes blood from the heart and then pumps it to the lungs or the gills, depending on what organism you're talking about. And then once it leaves the gills or the lungs, it goes back to the heart, then pumps this oxygenated blood to the rest of the body tissues. And so it's leaving directly from the heart and it has plenty of blood pressure. There is a problem, though, if the double circulatory system only has one ventricle. A single ventricle mixes oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and this is seen in lungfish, amphibians, and non-avian reptiles. Most non-avian reptiles. The one exception to that are the crocodilians. And this figure here is demonstrating the problem. Again, the red is fully oxygenated blood, the blue is deoxygenated, carbon dioxide-laden blood, and the purple is basically a mixture of those. So here you see blood leaving the lungs, dumping into the left atrium, that then dumps that into the ventricle. But you see the ventricle is also receiving blood from the rest of the body through the venous system, dumping into the right atrium. And so we're mixing up oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in this single ventricle. And so the blood is then pumped in the systemic system to the body at a good pressure, but it's not as oxygenated as it could be. And so you're not being as efficient at delivering maximally oxygenated blood. The evolution of the four-chambered heart made this a much more efficient system. This prevents the mixing of systemic and pulmonary circuit blood. And this is seen in mammals, birds, and crocodilians. And in contrast to the three-chambered double circulatory system we saw in the salamander, you can see now that when blood is pumped into the left atrium from the lungs, it then dumps into its own ventricle, the left ventricle, before it's pumped out to the rest of the body. And returning blood from the systemic system is dumped through the right atrium into the right ventricle before it's then pumped out into the lungs. This makes a complete separation of the two systems. So we have solved the pressure problem, but we've also solved the problem of mixing oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Most animals do not have a closed circulatory system. They have what is called an open circulatory system. In this case, there's no true or very limited connectivity of vessels between the heart and the body. Instead, blood is circulating in a hemocoel. Remember, coel means cavity, and hemo refers to blood, so the heart is basically just recirculating blood through this blood cavity or hemocoel. Now, there can be some internal baffles and walls or septa that help to direct this flow in more of a circular fashion, but there is no series of closed tubes. So this is how arthropods, mollusks, and most invertebrates circulate blood fluid throughout their body. So now let's move on to the respiratory system. When a biologist uses the term respiration, they could actually be meaning a couple of things. When you took cell biology, you spent a lot of time talking about cellular respiration. We've been referring to this as well, but I generally refer to it as aerobic metabolism. This is the oxidative process that occurs within cells where food is broken down into its component parts to release ATP. And oxygen is a key component needed in this cycle, in this process, and that's why it's called aerobic metabolism or cellular respiration. But the respiration we're going to be talking about here is external respiration. How do animals exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with the environment? And obviously this is going to be important if you're going to be able to do cellular respiration. You have to have the air for aerobic metabolism to work. And again, small animals have no problem with this, and protozoans don't have any problems with this. They simply have gas exchange directly diffuse across their cell membranes or their epithelium. And this is called cutaneous respiration. Examples of animals that do this are flatworms, cnidarians, and sponges. Most animals, however, that are living in an aquatic environment have gills, or another term for gills are branchia. These really work well in water because, as we're going to see, one requirement of a respiratory system is it has to be kept moist, and it also has to be connected to the circulatory system. Well, if you're an aquatic organism, keeping that structure moist isn't a problem. It's not going to dry out. So these gills or branchia are highly vascularized extensions of the body. So in a worm, like pictured on the left here, this cross section, these extensions of the body are called parapodia. Para meaning false, podia referring to foot. So these false feet-like structures, as the name implies, they're involved in locomotion, but they're nice surface area rich structures that serve for good gas exchange. And inside you can see they have a lot of respiratory capillaries. So there's a good blood supply. They're in the aquatic environment, and so these parapodia are never going to dry out. Because once a respiratory structure dries out, diffusion can't work. But as long as they're kept moist, it's going to work fine. Here's another example of a worm that has gills that are separate structures that it can retract within its body if it's threatened, but when it needs to exchange gas, it just sends that out of its body into the aquatic environment for absorption of oxygen and getting rid of CO2. In sea stars, you see these little bumps of skin that increase the surface area. These are called dermal papilla, and these also are respiratory structures. So in the previous example, those gills or branchia were external structures. Some aquatic organisms have internalized their gills, like in fish, some aquatic arthropods, and this mollusk pictured here. This provides just a little bit of extra protection for these highly vascularized structures so they don't get damaged. But if you're going to do this, you have to have a mechanism to draw water over these gills to effectively create a concentration gradient where you can have diffusion occur. And so fish open their mouths and then create a vacuum that draws water across the gills as it leaves the opercula at the rear end of the gill opening. Mollusks like clams and oysters have two apertures, an in-current aperture and an ex-current aperture, in which they're cycling water through. Water goes in the in-current aperture, driven over the gills, and then it leaves through the ex-current aperture. Now let's talk about the situation of respiration in the terrestrial environment. External respiration on land has several advantages, and the primary one is that there's a much higher oxygen concentration compared to water. Especially problematic is warm water. Warm water does not have a lot of dissolved oxygen, so there's far more oxygen available for diffusion in the terrestrial environment. But external respiration on land does come with its own problems. Remember, you have to keep a respiratory surface moist. So unless you live in a tropical rainforest and you have access to water and you can constantly go for a dip to keep, say, your skin moist, that's going to be a problem. You can't have gills that are just laying out there because they're going to dry out. Those fine structures are going to dry out too quickly. So in most cases, terrestrial organisms have internalized their respiratory surface, and they can regulate the air intake so that it doesn't dry out that respiratory surface. So let's talk about some of the systems used in the terrestrial environment. One of the most efficient is a tracheal tube system. Tracheal systems are a series of branched tubes, or trachea, that transport air to individual little pockets of cells. So you can think about these as being little snorkels between pockets of the body and the outside environment. Now they're connected to the outside environment with these external valves called spiracles. And the spiracles can open or close to regulate when air is going to go in and out. So if the respiratory surfaces or the internal body is getting too dry, they can shut that out and just respire when maybe the humidity is higher. And this is the system used in insects and other terrestrial arthropods. So some of you earlier may have been wondering, well, how can insects get by with an open circulatory system? That doesn't seem to be nearly as efficient. Well, this is one of the reasons they can get by with that, is because they don't have a centralized area like lungs where oxygen is absorbed in the body and then has to be delivered throughout the body. Instead, a tracheal tube system delivers oxygen directly to individual pockets of the body, and so there's less of a need for such an efficient circulatory system. Lungs do exist in terrestrial organisms. These are highly vascularized internal cavities where air is circulated in and out for gas exchange. And the lungs you're most familiar with are invertebrates, but some invertebrates do have lungs as well. So this is a terrestrial snail, and you can see right here they have this hole in their mantle cavity that is highly vascularized. You can see these pulmonary vessels that surround the mantle and invade the lung so that there is nice gas exchange with air that's absorbed in here. But this hole is called the pneumostome. That means breathing mouth. It's not the regular mouth. The mouth you can see down here, the mouth is just involved with ingestion of food. So a snail does not breathe through its mouth. It breathes through its pneumostome, which is a separate entrance into their lung. Same thing in some spiders. Some spiders have a book lung, seen here, and there's a separate opening to that into their abdomen. So again, a spider won't breathe through its mouth. It'll breathe through a separate opening going into the book lung. I say that only certain spiders have lungs. Other spiders have a tracheal tube system like insects. But again, the lungs you're most familiar with are seen in vertebrates, highly vascularized internal cavities where air is circulated in and out. But you can see in the evolution of vertebrates, there has been this general pattern to greater and greater complexity with relatively simple lungs in salamanders and frogs, lizards with more complex lungs with greater surface area for more efficient diffusion of oxygen into the blood supply and diffusion of CO2 from the blood supply into the lungs. Mammals, it's even more compact with more surface area, but by far the most efficient lungs in the animal kingdom are found in birds. And they have a much more complex system, not only dealing with lungs, but these structures called air sacs. And when we talk about birds, we'll go into more detail about what makes this a much more efficient system. So in review, we talked about the circulatory system seen in animals. Small animals don't have to have a circulatory system. They simply have diffusion of resources from the digestive system and the environment to deliver the materials directly to each individual pocket of the body. Other animals have closed systems, and some animals have an open system where there's pumping of blood, but it's not within a series of closed tubes. Then we moved on to respiratory systems, in which, again, small animals can get by with cutaneous respiration. Most aquatic animals have gills or branchia, sometimes internal, sometimes external. When you move into the terrestrial environment, then you start to encounter tracheal tube systems in most arthropods. Lungs are found both in invertebrates and vertebrates. And we talked about the different challenges and opportunities associated with terrestrial versus aquatic respiration, dealing primarily with the amount of oxygen that's available. More of it is available in the terrestrial environment. But a respiratory system to be effective, you have to keep the respiratory structures moist, and that can dry out too quickly in a terrestrial environment if you just have the respiratory structure in the environment.